Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Reem. And thanks to Socialist Alternative for the invitation to this very interesting conference. I'll try to keep the talk as brief as possible because it's a huge topic, as you know, very complex with so many ramifications and all that. And I'm sure you have a lot of questions. There are a lot of things that you would like to discuss, and I'm convinced that anyhow we won't have time to go in details in any even in any way or in discussing what you probably would want to. But nevertheless, let me leave the maximum time for discussion and just underline some of the key points. Let me start by a remark someone told me recently at some kind of meeting of this kind, that he, because it was a he, had read some of my statements recently, and he found me exceedingly optimistic about the situation in the region and in Egypt and the rest. And my reply was to say, well, had you read me in 2011 or the initial phase, you would have found me exceedingly pessimistic. And the question is, and what I'm trying to do now, is how not to be exceedingly pessimistic or optimistic, how to understand what's going on, and therefore have a correct assessment, what I would believe to be a correct assessment of what is going on. Because it's true that, I mean, when all this started in 2011 in the region, you had a global euphoria. And that global euphoria was not only people like us in this room. It was even the main media, the mainstream media and all that. It was the Arab Spring. The term itself said a lot about also the kind of perception that dominated about these events. They were seen, you know, as the last installment in the end of history that I was referring to yesterday. You know, when the Berlin Wall started crumbling, there was this guy, obscure at the time, who wrote his piece about the end of history, which became a bestseller after that, when he turned that into a book. And the idea was that, you know, now the whole world is turning into liberal democracy and free market, and that's the end of history. And so there was this kind of enclave resisting this trend in the Arab world, and here it is with the Arab Spring. You have the shift to liberal democracy because the free market, they got it there already to a certain degree, and that was it. That was the perception. So the term Arab Spring referred to a short-lived, you know, or not short-lived, short-term process through which you would have what in political science they like to call transition to democracy or democratic transition. So shifting from authoritarian or despotic governments to liberal democracies. And how do such processes end? Well, they end with organizing free elections and starting a constitutional process, and that's the end of the story. That's how Eastern Europe was seen at the time when you had these end of history theses, as, you know, going into this transition into liberal democracy and free market that would end history as far as far as this part of the world is concerned. Okay. So you had a lot of things. I mean, I could go on like that, but just to give you an example, and I'm reading just photocopies from a book by very serious scholars, but writing at the beginning of the uprising in the region, a few months into it, just to you can get the flavor of this kind of perception. So they said at the time. Well, I'm not going to read it because we don't have much time, just a few words here and there. They defined uprisings as representing a nascent post-ideological generation. So you got the end of ideology is an old theme. The common concerns which sparked uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Libya were not ideological or religious, nor did they evince any manifest interest in class consciousness or economic deprivation. Instead, their unifying ethos is the denouncement of poor governance, a catchword of the neoliberal vocabulary, oppression, and the recklessness and impunity of tyrants. So you see this attempt at portraying the events as purely concerned with democracy. It's a matter of just a political... and the corollary of all that was describing the event as a youth revolution, as if you had gray or old revolution. I mean, all revolutions, all uprisings are, in their majority, composed of relatively young people, although, you saw the pictures of Tahrir Square. It was far from being only young people, as portrayed. Or even worse, a Facebook revolution, which it was to a certain degree, in the sense that there's no possible denial of the fact that the new technologies played a role, and we can get back to that in the discussion, in the organization of the initial phase of the uprising. But of course, these phrases like Facebook revolution, youth revolution, all that are just trying to avoid a central and crucial aspect of the uprising. And I just, because also we don't have time, just show you two slides just to make the thing. The youth revolution is based on the idea that, and you probably, if you read the comments on the events at that time, you would have found countless comments about the fact that this is the most, or one of the most, one of the youngest regions in the world. The proportion of youth is very high, and that's why you have this, as if it was some kind of puberty eruption or whatever. And the fact is that even these assessments are wrong, because if we look at the real figures, it's true that up to 15 years ago or 20 years ago, the region, which is called the Middle East and North Africa, that's basically the Arab region, plus Iran for Middle East. But so the MENA region, as we call it, MENA, Middle East, North Africa. MENA used to have a higher proportion of young people until a decade or more ago. But it's no longer the case. If you look at the green columns of the young people, 15-29, you can see that there's no substantial difference between MENA, North Africa, Middle East, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or South Asia, or even Southeast Asia for that matter. They're practically the same thing. So it's not there. So, and that's the laziness, of course, of the media, of the comment. They don't even go and check the figures. They heard in the past that there's a high proportion of young people, and that's the explanation. Now, if we want to take a closer look and try to see what is peculiar about this region that might explain the fact that the uprising, you had this kind of uprising, you look at something else which they didn't see. You look at the unemployment rates. And there you see the unemployment rates for young people in the region, which are here in 2000 in blue, 2010 in red. North Africa, Middle East are far above the rest of the world, the rest of Asia and Africa, and actually the rest of the world. And that's a key point here. The peculiarity of the region is that it held for several decades record rates in unemployment in general, in youth unemployment in particular, and I should add female unemployment, but of course, female unemployment, part of it is part of youth unemployment. That's a different, they're cutting here. The key point here for the uprising is this massive youth unemployment over so many years, because this has been like that for several decades. And so from that we understand how wrong is the assessment that I read just a couple of minutes ago about the fact that these events have nothing to do with economic deprivation and class consciousness. And that's actually completely rubbish, because the reality is that the events from the start pointed very clearly to their social, economic, therefore class, also if you want, character. Even if we look at the fact that the two countries where everything started, Tunisia first, followed by Egypt, well, if these two countries have something special compared to the rest of the countries of the region, it was indeed the accumulation of social struggles in the two countries prior to the uprising in 2011. Tunisia had seen during the decade preceding the uprising, so the first decade of the century, several uprisings, actually, regional uprisings, contained regionally, but there were several of them, one major one in 2008 in the south of the country, on the issue of unemployment, social anger, always the demand of jobs at the very center, and protest against the social conditions, the standard of living, the purchasing power, and the rest. And actually, it is yet another of these regional uprisings that started on the 17th December 2010, when this young man, who's now become kind of a mythical figure, set himself on fire in central Tunisia, that led to another regional uprising, with the difference that this time the regional uprising spread to the whole country, and from the whole country to the whole region. It embraced the whole region because the whole region is facing the same kind of problem. If you look at Egypt, you will see that Egypt, during the decade that preceded the uprising, has seen the most important wave of workers' strikes in its history, in its entire history in terms of scope. Starting from 2004, 2005, you have the beginning of this huge wave of, as they call it, industrial unrest or industrial action of all kinds, strikes and other forms of action, that peaked in 2007, 2008, with the big strikes of the textile workers, but remained at a high level until 2011. So we can see even in that how much this uprising has direct roots not only in the political issue of democracy or whatever. Of course, this is there, but despotism has been in the region, unfortunately, for so long, so it's not something new. It's not that suddenly people became thirsty for democracy. Of course, there is a democratic dimension. No one can deny that, of the whole uprising, but it is very, very narrowly, intimately connected to the social economic dimension. This is even before being a democratic uprising. It is a democratic uprising, but it is even before that. It is a social uprising. It's a class uprising. It is about the social economic condition that people, and this is translated in the demands, and the demands even of the major demonstrations. If you take Tunisia, the demands about jobs were all the time there. If you take Tahrir Square, one of the main slogans is bread, freedom, social justice. Well, you have freedom, but you have bread and social justice. So you can see the two components intimately connected: the political one and the social economic one. So, this has its roots. I don't have time to get into that, but this has its roots in, as I tried to very briefly summarize yesterday in the opening meeting. Neoliberalism at the global level had the most pernicious effects in this part of the world because of the peculiarities of this part of the world. So it's not enough to explain things by neoliberalism. You have to go to the kind of social class structure that you have in this region, that is peculiar to this region, and that gets to these terrible results with states, specific states. Well, I'm not getting into that now. There's a long explanation in the book for anyone interested. But we have to understand that there is a specific class nature, social, political nature of the dominant states in the region, which produces this situation. And I can show you other figures. You would see that this same region, the explanation of this is in the fact that for the last few decades, since the 70s, this is the part of the world with the lowest rates of growth globally. And this is related to what I refer to the kind of class class nature of the states, and the effect of neoliberal transformation within this kind of context. Now, this leads, I mean, the social economic roots of the events leads to this, I mean, to the characterization I give to what happened. Not an Arab Spring, which is a very bad formula. It's unfortunately became kind of common term, but I keep saying this is the worst possible and the most misleading characterization of what happened. It is what I would call a long-term, emphasizing long-term revolutionary process. That is, what started is no doubt about that, a revolutionary process. It's not an accomplished revolution. It's, of course, it's just the beginning. And we have to understand, if we understand this well, we understand that it won't end before such issues are solved. And it's not for tomorrow. Okay, you understand that it will take many, many years, if not decades, when this kind of process is closer to what, for instance, you have in mind when you say the English Revolution, when you say the French Revolution. You don't think of a few weeks. You think of many years, if not decades, actually, over a century sometime, of change and transformation. That's what was ignited in 2011 in the region. That's how we have to understand things. And this leads you also to precisely to avoid the exceedingly optimistic or exceedingly pessimistic kind of perspectives. And that's what we've got. We've got people, and the same usually, shifting from total euphoria in 2011 to completely, very gloomy mood presently, seeing everything as, disastrous and dead, basically. You even had someone who wrote a piece on Egypt, in a mainstream literary journal, titled "The Revolution That Wasn't." So that there was not even a revolution there. So, I mean, and you have permanently now, since the year 2011 or 2012, you have what I call premature obituaries of the whole uprising, but repeatedly. First one was when you had the initial electoral victories of the Islamic fundamentalist forces in Tunisia and Egypt. And so you had, at that time, so many comments saying, well, the Arab Spring, and sticking to the seasonal analogy, turned into an Islamic winter. We heard that so much. Yeah? So they believed that, Morsi came to power, that's the end of it. It was, one human, one vote, one time. That's the end of it. This is now Islamic fundamentalism. And actually, these guys in this region, this is in their culture. They are accustomed, they are addicted to despotism and religion. These kind of Orientalist, racist perspective came back with a vengeance. After the 2011, they are like us in the West. They have some young Democrats. So, it shifted back. You see, I told you, Muslims. Just Morsi is good for them. So the idea was that Morsi would be the end of the story. Well, that was completely short-sighted. If you read, you see this book, it was written, it was finished, the last editing was the end of October 2012. So Morsi had been elected just 3 months before that. And that was even before some of the major events under Morsi. And there is an assessment here saying that he is doomed to fail. He will fail sooner than later because he has not the beginning of a clue of what to do with the social economic situation. Actually, one of the key figures in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt said, when Morsi came to power, the previous economic policy was correct, except that there was corruption. So we are the ethical guys, as you know, as good religious people. We'll solve corruption, we'll keep the economic policy. Well, it didn't work at all, as you may imagine. And Morsi was defeated above all by the wave of strikes and the social unrest that carried on and increased during his time, with unemployment getting more and more massive. And then he was overthrown. And so the Islamic winter proved as short as the Arab Spring, between quote marks. Yeah? And now you have this guy, Sisi, on the horizon. And again, you have obituaries. Now they are no longer the Islamic winter. They are, well, you know, their culture is they like strong men. You know, there is Oriental despotism. Yeah. So this is again part of the culture and all that. These views that and using the to a great extent very artificial cult created around Sisi in order also to bury this revolution or this uprising. And this is also short-sighted, and we can see it from the fact that over the last 2 months, over the last few weeks, Egypt is going again into a tremendous wave of worker strikes. Over the last few weeks, there have been a huge wave of worker strikes affecting all major sectors of the economy. Even the conscripts of the interior minister went on strike. Yeah? So when the repressive forces themselves go on strike, this means that nothing is working. And that's the situation that this Sisi, who actually was reluctant to run for president, it was more comfortable for him to remain at the head of the real power, which is the army, than to have to face all these strikes and all that. So that's the problem that they will be facing. So the uprising, the revolutionary process is very far from finished. And again, I repeat, it's actually at its beginning. And therefore, you don't need to be exceedingly optimistic or pessimistic. You have to understand that this is going on and will go on for very long until real solutions can be brought or found to these issues. Otherwise, of course, because the optimistic outcome is not to be taken for granted, unfortunately, there are always possibilities of pessimistic scenarios prevailing in the end. And again, this can be summarized in the famous formula, well known but very, very deep, actually, if you think of it, of the prospect of really, I mean, either you have changes and transformations in a socialist direction, or you may have a descent into barbarism. The kind of barbarism that the invasion of Iraq triggered in that country when we look at this poor country today. Now, to end up with just a few words about some of the complexities of this whole revolutionary process. Because it is, I mean, everything I said until now might sound as if it is just one of a classical kind of revolutionary process. It's not, in many senses, when we look at today's world. In the sense, first of all, that you have differences between the kind of states in the region. But the fact that it looked relatively easy and peaceful, with quote marks, because you had quite an important number of people killed, even at the first stage in both Tunisia and Egypt, is the fact that these are states where the institution of the state was more important than the ruler themselves. And therefore, it was possible under these specific conditions to see what we saw in Egypt and that people missed in 2011, that in 2011 and 2013, I mean, what you had, I mean, everyone said 2013 is a coup, the army removing Morsi. But 2011 was a coup also. 11 February 2011, the army removed Morsi and actually took power directly, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. It was the most classical coup possible in that sense. So this kind of scenario is not possible everywhere, because in other states, like Syria, like Libya, like the Saudi Kingdom, like Bahrain, like so many of them, actually the majority of the states of the region, there is no autonomy of the state as an institution from the rulers. They rule, the ruling families own the state, and the state is just a private guard of the ruling family, who will be willing to use the state, kill the people, destroy the country, as you can see in Syria today, to stick to power. And that's why this is not going to be anything like the smooth, peaceful, process portrayed in 2011. And anyone knowing really the region, I'm one of them, would have known that from the start. That's why I was never in this euphoria. I was very, very happy about the beginning of uprising, but understanding all the problems that would be faced. And in those countries where we had the so-called spring, like Tunisia and Egypt, that was only the tip of the iceberg. And that had to be underlined. You had a lot of illusions in Egypt in 2011, if you remember, about the army. When the army removed Mubarak, you had the same slogans: the army and the people are one hand and the rest. They were renewed now, but in the same way that these illusions dissipated quite quickly in 2011, you can be sure that they won't. The cult, this kind of cult created around Sisi, will not be able to stand the test of events. Second point is that this region, for historical reasons, has seen the development in the opposition to the existing regimes, of reactionary forces. Forces on the basis of religious programs, religious fundamentalist programs, which were at the beginning favored or fostered by the regimes themselves as an antidote to the left-wing forces. That started in the 70s and 80s. Classical case is Egypt, where Sadat released from jail the Muslim Brotherhood and let them organize and all that. So these forces could develop. And when the uprising started, you had this convergence against the regimes of forces with very different agendas. You looked at Tahrir Square, for instance. You would see Salafists, Muslim Brotherhoods, Trotskyists, odd combination, of course, Stalinists, liberals, whatever. So you had this kind of convergence there, and this meant that potentially one had to understand that it's not a classical case of revolution versus counter-revolution. You don't have one counter-revolution only in the region, if you want, which is represented classically by the Ancien regime, the old regime. You have at least two counter-revolutions. One, which is the Ancien regime, another one, which was part of the uprising, and through which imperialism and Washington, for instance, and the Qatari and all that tried to co-opt the uprising and deviated from anything progressive, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist whatsoever, into the kind of experience, for instance, that you had in Egypt under Morsi. So these are some points about the complexity of the whole process. And basically, I said, we can't take it for granted that this will end. This will have a happy end, the end of the whole process, whenever it comes. The possibility of a happy end, if you want, depends primarily on the ability of the left of building itself as a third force equally opposed to the old state, to the Ancien regime, and to the reactionary religious forces. It is only if the left is able to build itself as a force at equal distance from these two poles, instead of oscillating, as we have seen, unfortunately, in the region, from alliance with one against the other to alliance with the other against the first, in the second stage. What is needed is confronting both in this triangular struggle as it is developing. So this is the key condition. In the meantime, the main gain, the main achievement of the whole uprising is the one that is summarized by the slogan the most ubiquitous slogan of the Arab uprising, which starts with "the people want." Usually it's the people want to overthrow the regime, or it can be other demands. The people want. This idea that you can express massively the people's will, and when the people express massively their will, they can impose their will, it's a very, very important idea. It leads even to a conception of democracy that is, to be frank, more radical than the one we are accustomed to in the liberal democracies, where the sovereignty of the people is one day every few years when you put your bulletin in the ballot box. You saw in Egypt how people in action practiced the right to recall, which is a major condition, a major requirement of a real, true democracy. That is, the sovereignty of the people should be practiced, exercised every day. The people elect, but the elected don't have, as we have in our liberal democracy, don't become free of doing what they want once elected. They should remain under popular control, and when they fail to deliver what they promised or what people expected, people should have the right to recall them and to organize new elections, as we have seen, albeit with the army intervening at the end. But if you think of what happened against Morsi, this mass mobilization, the young people who launched this petition and who gathered millions of signatures demanding new elections, well, this is democracy in action as we wish it all over the world. Thank you very much.